Welcome to the HGR Digital Asset Group podcast, where we speak with very insightful thought leaders in the cryptocurrency space. Today, we're very lucky to have Professor Benn Konsynski with us. He is the George S. Kraft Distinguished University Professor of Information Systems and Operations Management at the Goizueta Business School at Emory. And previously, he spent 6 years on the faculty at Harvard Business School, where he taught a combination of MBA programs and executive programs as well. So, Professor Benn, how are you doing today?
I'm fine. Good to talk to you.
I've met you in person several times and want to thank you so much for your mentorship. So the first question is, I know you teach a digital disruption class at Emory, and one of the disruptive technologies that you teach your class is on the blockchain. I think one of the very interesting facts that I learned about you is that Barry Silbert was one of your students. Can you tell us about which industries you think are the most ripe for blockchain disruption?
I think the aspect of distributed ledger elements are needed in certain areas. So the first issue is the immutability of record. Wherever an immutable record is needed, there's a promise for it. Wherever there is sort of the concomitant need for immutable record and distributed ledger structure to build trust, then that's needed. Where those factors are needed to replace trust, to replace traditional intermediaries, those are good opportunities as well. So I think there are different market characteristics that bring to bear the opportunity. The need and necessity to start with the issue of the trust factor, where the traditional or historic trust institutions are questioned or questionable or subject to disintermediation. That's where I want to start. Now the question is the solution the engines and technologies in crypto that are essential to it, and so that's where you get into the questions of which ones need a new basis of trust, a distributed ledger, and by the way, one that has immutable records based on a consensus agreement at time of record.
Got it. Perfect. So would you say a lot of people in the industry think that banking, accounting, and maybe supply chain management, maybe retail would be the first industries to maybe harness this technology effectively, either as their back office financial plumbing or as a more efficient way to carry out their operations. Would you agree with that with these industries, or do you have other industries in mind?
Not necessarily the way they're approaching it. And here, look at the evolution of the portfolio of the companies in Barry Silbert's organization in DCG, because you look at some of the more interesting early applications are in areas of art provenance, say a company in France, or record of real estate transactions and ownership, say in the UK. When you have a Syrian refugee that comes out of Syria, what's the evidence and historic record associated with their ownership of assets in that country and the legacy? These are the kinds of situations that have arisen that leverage these technologies first. And to just apply them willy-nilly in historic centralized organizations is going to be an interesting challenge, because they're engaged in embracing the terminology of it, but will they abandon their historic centralized single copy accessible, or at least non-immutable records that they have had in the past? And I think a lot of the people using these terms right now are not honest with themselves about their willingness to embrace the true value of these technologies. And so there's a lot more talk than real action, and a lot more speculation than actual exercise in certain industries.
Yes, I think those are.
Yet at the same time, there's a great necessity to rethink. In other words, to do old line banking, I think it's an unfair application. The centralized structures and even decentralized structures need to move in mentally into truly distributed areas, and that's where these technologies offer a greater insight into possibilities. But if you're just speeding up the mess, or think you're speeding up the mess, then I don't think it's a fair exercise or use of it. Seeking efficiency is a 20th century aspiration. I don't think that our aspiration should be industrial age in the 21st century.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with a lot of those points. You mentioned the Syrian refugees, and it reminded me of blockchain's potential applications to identity. And I think identity, there's individual identity, and there's also corporate identities. And one thing that is pretty interesting is the Wyoming Blockchain Coalition. They're trying to pass a series of bills where you can register your company on a distributed ledger by the government. And I think the idea there is, when you look at the states that are most favorable to company registrations in the U.S., it's typically Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada. And I think the folks at Wyoming, they're trying to get a leg up in this registration business through blockchain, because I think every time a new business is registered, they earn roughly like $100 per business just on that registration. So I think that's pretty interesting. But another
I think that the registration matters big time, and that's a good application. So there's an instance where I need a immutable record, and I need a distributed ledger as a corollary to it. Commerce itself is based on authentication and attestation. Who are you, and what authorities do you have? Whether you're a company or a person, I need to know who you are and what authorities you have. In the past, and often to reduce the friction in commerce, we relax those things. If I have a paper currency, I don't need to know who you are, as long as as I perceive I'm getting the value of that currency. As we start moving into other forms of patterns of exchange, I need to have other means of identifying, authenticating who you are, and attesting to what rights you have.
Yes.
You have the right to do this thing that you want to do.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. One of the other comments that you talked about, technological progress. I think today the pace of technological innovation is so fast. So I think a good example of this is in the past 13 years, it would have cost you 100 million to sequence each human genome, but now I think it only costs 1,000. So before, a lot of people were talking about Moore's law, but it seems like now technology can even grow at an exponential rate, a lot faster than before. And I guess, given the new pace of technological development, how do you see how do you see the timeline of these blockchain technologies being implemented into more, at a greater scale, less of the speculation, as you mentioned? Or do you think, let's say, it can be part of mainstream financial systems in 10 years, 20 years, or do you think it could be sooner than that?
Well, I think it will be sooner than that, and it's going to grow from the outside. You have a horse race between the traditional institutions trying to find relevance in a 21st century world and the new upstarts and startups and innovators that are coming in and starting with a clean slate and a green field and able to intercede payment systems, for example, and other things like that they can come in outside of the traditional institutions. But they feed on each other. They accelerate the range and reach of the technologies. That horse race between the incumbents and those that are disrupting.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think a lot of some people in the remittance space are getting a bit worried because that's one of the industries that incumbents might be displaced in. And I come from the Philippines, right? And I think a huge chunk of our economy is from overseas Filipino workers, and I think there's a huge potential for that. And there's already been a lot of blockchain-based companies that do business-to-business financial plumbing transfers for remittances. They don't necessarily advertise their company as a blockchain company, but they use it underneath. And I think so far they've been able to facilitate transfers cheaper than the Western unions of the world.
Absolutely. I think things like that, like ACH, and there's no reason I should be paying $30 or $40 for a financial transaction, and certainly there are means where it can cost $1 or $2 or less, even less, that are as trustworthy in those spaces.
Yeah, and another interesting fact that I recently read up on is that banks are closed on weekends, so you actually can't make overseas transfers on the weekends, whereas you still could in other platforms, right? So I think
that's a very good point. The legacy culture of the incumbents sometimes are their biggest boat anchor. It's not only resistance to change, but their continued compliance with their own historic assumptions. And I don't have to work in banking hours. I worked with, I can recall 30 years ago talking to banks when ATMs were rolling out and with banking systems. And as we were talking about where those might go, you see the old line bankers saying that the basis of trust was the relationship in the retail banking with the teller. And I said, well, you don't understand that the few hours you're open during the day are becoming less important to the individual rather than having them have access to their banking assets wherever they are. Now, in those days, it was pre-mobile, and the ATMs mattered a lot. And that shifted into the mobile. So the race that they were ignoring or pretending they could hold back is on the basis of saying that the trust basis was with the teller, and in fact, it never was.
Yeah.
It moved away quite quickly. If I could trust the transaction in ATM, and then now if I can trust the transaction in the online systems, or if I can trust the transactions that are even going to be a part of smart contracts down the road. And and we haven't mentioned that to this point, but clearly I think smart contracts are very important to the future, and getting into robotic activities too, and automatic activities that historically have had human intervention.
Yeah, those are very insightful points. I wasn't born 30, I wasn't alive like 30 years ago, but it just really allows me to appreciate like your wisdom and your knowledge, right? Like you've been around for a long time, and you've been at the forefront of technological innovation for a long time, and yeah, that's super impressive. You also mentioned that legacy systems often are a huge obstacle for maybe developed countries to adopt blockchain technologies. Do you see developing countries as potentially faster early adopters to this technology? I think, for example, in the Philippines, where I'm from, we get one form of money, although not as prominent as other places like Kenya's M-Pesa. We can use mobile phone minutes as money, and we can just send like load. Load is basically, how much prepaid minutes you have, um, to other people. And in Kenya, I think there was a statistic recently saying that most people don't have bank accounts, but they have phones. So their phones their phones are more useful to them than a bank account as a platform to send and receive money.
I think that those are very important points that you're talking about, and M-Pesa is a very good example. The issue of non-banked individuals, and the necessity, challenging the necessity for bank relationships, or making bank associations automatic. Several countries automatically, Georgia, for example, the country of Georgia, whose former prime minister also was one of my students.
Oh wow!
They put out a automatic account, set up automatically accounts. San Francisco, if you look at Bank On San Francisco, and what Jose Cisneros has been doing in San Francisco, is they'll take homeless people, register homeless people, and automatically set up accounts for them. In this case, maybe through traditional banks, but they don't necessarily need it. But what M-Pesa demonstrated in the early days as it evolved, I did not need smartphones. I needed a phone, and I did not need a banking institution. I needed a new intermediary institution that's much leaner and faster responding. And so I can make payments for education and things like that via the phone, that circumvents the historic infrastructures that we've had, the banking institution infrastructures, as well as the transaction processing activities, which did not require a smartphone. And I think you also mentioned the other issue, a critical issue of the nature of the currency and nature of the value exchange. And minutes have certainly always been a leading indicator, a canary in the coal mine, to see that you can have other fungible value exchange that matters other than the currency exchange.
Yeah, so that actually leads me to my next point. It's about financial regulation. I think there's often times where technology evolves very fast that laws occasionally can't keep up, right? So I think before in the early days of the internet, I think in Bernstein versus the U.S. Department of Justice, cryptographic software before had traditionally been classified as weapons. And I think at that time, the Arms Export Control Act and the International Traffic in Arms Regulations required Bernstein to submit his ideas about cryptography to the government to review and to register as an arms dealer. and to obtain a license from the government to publish his ideas essentially on software. So I think that's an instance where laws and regulatory bodies are not really doing a good job, right? And I think in Bernstein's case, luckily the EFF, or the Electronic Frontier Foundation, I think, came to his defense, and eventually the court held that the software source code was a form of speech, and that speech was protected by the First Amendment. So I guess right now there are similar problems with the regulation of a lot of these crypto assets and cryptocurrencies. Do you think the FinCEN, the CFTC, and the SEC are doing a good job? And in general, what type of role do you think they should play, and how active should they be?
One historically would look at career-based governmental institution structures as bureaucratic, entrenched, operating slow. It's almost ironic now that they're the salvation often in these areas, and the seeds of innovative thought, as opposed to Congress, for example, that tries to make laws without understanding the technology dimensions. And we need no further witness than the historic practice on the internet. So who we rely on for the leadership of governance there is often interesting. It's not different. The executive branch under Bill Clinton initiated the tax moratorium on the internet that would have held back, had we not done that, would have held back a lot of progress. George W. Bush renewed that, and so did Obama under the Obama administration. So the executive branch can be a leader. Congress could be a leader. Case law can lead. The bureaucratic institutions, FCC, for example, under Tom Wheeler, I had great fears in the beginning when Tom Wheeler took over there because of his historic lobbying roles and things like that. But he turned out to be a brilliant defender of net neutrality. And unfortunately, that was lost. So at different times, you look to different venues to stand and do what needs to be done. And the key thing is to make sure that the entrenchment doesn't get in the way of it, meaning a complacent Congress that can't act or is highly partisan, or an executive branch that is not very bright or progressive, a governmental institution that may be corrupted or lobbied or biased, or an insufficient body of case law that might not constrain, that would constrain degrees of freedom. So in the mix, I look for heroes in among the mix, and or a Supreme Court, courts themselves becoming a part of it. And you can't say there's going to be one heroic venue. And so sometimes I've been disappointed by one or more of those, and other times I've seen them as the salvation for progress and innovation.
Yeah, those are excellent points, and I totally agree. I think sometimes the Congress is super slow, and maybe in some instances just signing an executive order can be more beneficial for the advancement of these technologies. And I think it's also very important for the US to stay competitive and stay innovative. Like, you don't want to be losing out to countries like China and Russia in innovation, right? And I actually have one last question. It's about financing via initial coin offerings or ICOs. Do you think that venture capitalists are at risk? How do you see VC's role changing in the future? In your last class that I attended, I think there was a presentation where one of the panelists talked about how ICO financing has surpassed in terms of dollar amounts early stage venture capital financing, and I thought that was super mind blowing. Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're in nascent stages in ICOs, and we're getting sort of sometimes abusive reach for some of that, and we haven't faced the reality of some of the implications of it. How do I, in M&A, if I'm acquiring and rolling up companies, how do I deal with the valuation of a company that had an ICO and deal with the assets and token issues that attend to rolling over when there's not an equity tie on the acquisition? So there's some things we have to shape out on that, and I think SEC will play a role in that side. I think the advent of airdrop and other approaches are interesting as well, where I think we're in experimental phases here. So I don't want to celebrate the growth until we start to grow safe, and I don't know that we are in the ICO arena, because we don't necessarily know the long-term implications for what sound like very short-term attractive approaches to reaching in the market. So I'm somewhat reserved on it. I think there's huge promise here, but I don't think we've shaped it up, and we'll take a look at that with airdrop and other things.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think abusive is one of the best words that I've heard someone use, and I think I'm going to steal that and use that in my future conversations. That reminds me of two things. First is there was a ICO recently where they stole a picture of Ryan Gosling, the actor of La La Land, and they basically just gave him another name and put him as web designer, and they still raised like $600,000, which is ridiculous. And then the second point is, I think overly abundant capital for early stage companies can be very harmful, right? It encourages entrepreneurs and founding teams to be very reckless in capital budgeting. And I think one thing that a lot of industry leaders think about is, maybe as the ICO landscape evolves, there will likely be a shift to structures that resemble VC-based milestone investing. So instead of launching one ICO to generate a lump sum payment, token generation events should evolve to help companies deploy capital only when they need it, or when a specific company's business model receives validation at different stages. I think the analogy that one of our other podcast speakers talked about, Miko Matsumura, is like a company. You can think of a company as like a small plant that you're cultivating, and obviously you want to give it a lot of resources, but you want to give it resources at the right rate. You don't want to put like 5 kilos of soil on a small plant when it's not ready, or water it with like 10 liters of water and other nutrients, right? So yeah.
I think that's an excellent point. And when they're tied to performance and staged and phased, one of the nice things about this is that complexity in this world, complexity doesn't matter as much as it used to. And so we can absolutely think of releases and stages and phasing of participation, so that actually I can tie it to performance levels, and instead of just all speculative up front on it. And I think more and more of these issues relate not just to a simple white paper that's all speculative, and rather tie it to stages of white paper progress and advancement and promise, and making sure that promise is delivered.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Professor Ben, for your insights. I think in my Emory experience, one of my biggest highlights was getting to know you. I think you've been one of the most helpful professors, even though I've never even taken your class, and you've always been like super willing to help. So I really appreciate that. And
no, happy to.
Yeah,
I thrive on your enthusiasm and interest.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. Hopefully I didn't keep you for too long. And yeah, I hope to see you around in the business school.
Oh, happy to. Good luck.
All right. Thank you so much, Professor.